You people always act nervous when I ask simple questions. Officer Daniel Mercer's voice cut through the freezing rain as red and blue lights pulsed across the wet highway like warning signals from another world. Cars rolled slowly past on Interstate 85, their tires hissing against soaked pavement while cold November wind rattled the loose plastic sign outside a closed gas station nearby. Nia Brooks stood beside her dark gray Toyota Camry with both hands resting flat against the hood, rainwater dripping from the sleeves of her black coat. Her curls clung damply to the side of her face, but she didn't wipe the water away. She barely moved at all. Mercer circled her car slowly, flashlight beam cutting through the windows. "This vehicle registered to you?" he asked again, louder this time, like he wanted the passing drivers to hear. Nia kept her voice calm. "Yes, officer." Mercer smirked without looking at her. "Funny. Doesn't look like your type of car." A pickup truck passing by slowed down enough for the passenger to stare. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled low across the Atlanta sky. Nia inhaled quietly through her nose and watched her own breath disappear into the cold air. She was exhausted. 18 straight hours awake. Coffee and vending machine crackers since noon. The only thing waiting for her at home was another alarm in 4 hours and a voicemail from the hospital reminding her to pick up her mother's medication before midnight. The paper pharmacy bag sat in the back seat, getting damp from the cracked window. Mercer insisted she leave open during the stop. "License and registration," Mercer said again, impatient now. Nia reached carefully into her coat pocket. The movement made Mercer tense immediately. His hand hovered near his belt. "Slow," he warned. "Very slow." She handed him the documents without argument. Mercer glanced at the address, then at her face, then back at the car. "You live 20 miles from here. What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Nia blinked once. "Driving home." Mercer let out a dry laugh. "At 11:30 at night?" Rain tapped harder against the roof of the Camry. A pair of headlights washed over them before disappearing into darkness. Nia could feel eyes on her from the road now. People always looked longer when police lights were involved. Mercer leaned closer toward her window, shining his flashlight across the seats. "Anything illegal in the vehicle?" "No, sir." "Weapons?" "No drugs?" "No." Mercer nodded slowly like he didn't believe a single word. "Step away from the car." Nia obeyed without hesitation. Her sneakers splashed into shallow water gathering near the curb. The cold had started creeping through her clothes almost an hour ago, but she refused to let herself shiver. Mercer walked back toward his cruiser with her license in hand while the radio on his shoulder crackled softly. Nia stared down the empty stretch of highway ahead of her. She could still hear her mother's weak voice from earlier that afternoon. "Don't work too hard tonight, baby. Come home safe." The memory tightened quietly inside her chest. Behind her, Mercer suddenly raised his voice again. "You know," he called out while typing something into his computer, "most innocent people don't look this uncomfortable during a stop." Nia slowly turned her head toward him, rain sliding down her cheekbone like tears she refused to show. Most innocent people aren't treated like suspects before they even speak. For the first time since the stop began, Mercer looked directly at her. The flashing lights reflected sharply in his pale eyes while traffic continued flowing around them like the entire world had decided not to stop for what was happening on that lonely stretch of road. The rain eased slightly, but the cold stayed trapped in the air like something heavy that refused to move on. Officer Mercer remained inside his cruiser, typing slowly while the glow from his dashboard computer lit the sharp angles of his face blue and white. Nia stood beside the Camry with her arms folded tightly across herself, not for attitude, not for defiance, but simply to hold on to whatever warmth she still had left. Water dripped steadily from the edge of her sleeves onto the asphalt below. Across the highway, the giant red letters of a 24-hour pharmacy flickered weakly through the mist. Midnight was less than 30 minutes away. She looked toward it for half a second before lowering her eyes again. In the back seat of the Camry, the white pharmacy bag had tipped sideways. One corner rested against a folded gray blanket she kept for her mother during hospital visits. A small orange bottle had rolled partially out of the bag during the stop. Even from where she stood, Nia could still read the black printed label with her mother's last name on it. Brooks. The sight of it tightened her chest more than Mercer's questions ever could. Earlier that evening, she had sat beside her mother in a dim hospital room while freezing rain struck the windows 13 floors above downtown Atlanta. The television mounted in the corner had played an old sitcom with the volume too low to understand. Her mother barely watched it anyway. She had fallen asleep halfway through a sentence while holding Nia's hand. Nia remembered carefully pulling the blanket higher over her shoulders before leaving the room. Her mother always looked smaller after chemotherapy treatments. Smaller every month. You still with me over there? Mercer's voice pulled her back to the roadside. He stepped out of the cruiser holding her license between two fingers like it annoyed him personally. Because I am waiting on answers. Nia uncrossed her arms slowly. I answered every question you asked. Mercer tilted his head slightly. You answered them calmly. That is different. Another vehicle passed by slower this time. Nia noticed a teenage boy in the passenger seat staring directly at her through the rain-streaked window. His mother quickly told him to face forward again. Mercer walked around the Camry once more, flashlight moving carefully over the tires, the bumper, the rear windshield. He stopped near the trunk. Mind opening this for me? Nia looked at him steadily. Do you have a reason to search my vehicle, officer? Mercer smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. You know, people who cooperate usually get home faster. Nia could feel exhaustion pressing against the back of her eyes now. Her head ached behind her temples from too much coffee and too little sleep. Still, her voice stayed level. I do cooperate. I also know my rights. Mercer let the silence sit there between them while rainwater collected near the toes of his boots. Somewhere nearby, a siren echoed faintly through the city before disappearing again. Then his radio crackled on his shoulder. A burst of static. A dispatcher's voice too distorted to understand. Mercer ignored it. What exactly do you do for work, Ms. Brooks? He asked suddenly. Nia hesitated for the first time all night. Not because she feared him. Because she was tired. Tired of explaining herself to strangers who had already decided who she was before she even opened her mouth. I work downtown, she said quietly. Mercer smirked again. That clears it right up. Nia glanced toward the pharmacy sign glowing red through the rain. 11:28. 4 minutes left before the prescription counter closed. Officer Mercer stared at the Camry for several long seconds without saying anything else, as if silence itself were another tool he liked to use during stops like this. Rainwater slid off the brim of his cap and onto the shoulders of his dark uniform while the blue lights from the cruiser painted the highway in restless flashes. Nia remained beside the car, her fingers cold enough to ache now. Across the road, the pharmacy sign blinked again. 11:31. The prescription counter was closed. She lowered her eyes for a moment after realizing it. Not because of the inconvenience. Because she already knew what her mother would say tomorrow morning when she apologized. It is all right, baby. I know you are trying. That was always the worst part. Her mother never complained. Mercer walked slowly back toward her, holding the flashlight low against his leg now. You know what I think? He asked casually. Nia did not answer. I think you got somewhere important to be and you are getting nervous because this stop is messing up your plans. Nia looked at him calmly despite the exhaustion pulling at every muscle in her body. I already told you where I was going. Mercer nodded once. Right. Home. He glanced toward the back seat again. Funny thing is, People carrying illegal stuff always say they are just trying to get home. A white SUV rolled past them slowly before accelerating again. The driver stared openly this time. Nia could feel the weight of strangers building around the stop now. Curious eyes. Quiet assumptions. Mercer seemed to enjoy it. He stood straighter whenever another car passed. "Step over here," he said, motioning toward the front of the cruiser. Nia obeyed. Her wet sneakers scraped softly against the pavement. Mercer leaned one shoulder against the police vehicle and crossed his arms. "I have been doing this job 14 years, he said. "You learn patterns after a while." Nia remained silent. Neighborhoods. Cars. Attitudes. The way people answer questions. He shrugged lightly. "Usually my instincts are right." Nia looked at him carefully then. Not angry. Not afraid. Just tired in a way that went deeper than lack of sleep. Instincts can become excuses when you stop seeing people as individuals. Mercer's jaw tightened slightly. The comment landed harder than he expected. For a second, the rain and passing traffic were the only sounds between them. Then he gave a dry chuckle. "That sounds like something from a college seminar." Nia did not respond. Mercer uncrossed his arms and stepped closer to the Camry again. "Pop the trunk." "Officer, am I being detained for something specific?" Mercer sighed dramatically like her question itself annoyed him. "See, that right there? That attitude. Knowing the law is not an attitude." Mercer looked back toward the highway where another set of headlights slowed briefly near the shoulder. "Depends who is using it." Nia could feel the cold settling deeper into her soaked clothes now. Her phone vibrated once inside her coat pocket. Probably the hospital. Probably another reminder she was already too late to answer. She ignored it. Mercer noticed the vibration immediately. "Phone stays where it is. I was not reaching for it." "Good." The radio on Mercer's shoulder crackled again, louder this time. Dispatch mentioned something about federal coordination downtown before static swallowed the rest. Mercer pressed the button impatiently. "Unit 12 occupied. Traffic stop in progress." Then he looked back at Nia and shook his head. Slowly. "You know what your problem is, Ms. Brooks?" Nia met his eyes under the flashing lights. "No, officer." Mercer slipped her license back into his pocket instead of handing it over. "You carry yourself like somebody who thinks the rules do not apply to her." For the first time all night, something flickered behind Nia's eyes. Not fear. Not anger. Something quieter. Disappointment. The rain finally softened into a thin cold drizzle, but the flashing patrol lights kept washing the roadside in red and blue like the night itself could not settle down. Nia stood motionless beside the Camry while Officer Mercer slowly paced around the vehicle again, his boots splashing through shallow puddles gathering near the shoulder of the highway. A gust of wind swept across the open road hard enough to shake the loose branches of a pine tree overhead. Somewhere beyond the darkness, tires hissed across wet pavement without stopping. The world kept moving while this moment stretched longer and longer. Mercer stopped near the driver's side door and tapped the glass twice with the back of his flashlight. "Open it." Nia looked at him carefully. "For what reason?" Mercer exhaled sharply through his nose. "You really like making things difficult for yourself." "I am asking a lawful question." Mercer stepped closer until the flashing lights reflected across the rainwater on his jacket. "And I am giving you a lawful instruction." Nia glanced briefly toward the dashboard clock glowing faintly through the windshield. 11:36. Her mother would already be asleep in the hospital room by now, probably still waiting for medicine that would not arrive until morning. The thought settled heavily inside her chest, but her face remained calm. "Officer," she said quietly, "if you are requesting consent to search my vehicle, I do not consent." Mercer stared at her for a moment like he was deciding whether to be offended or amused. Then he laughed once under his breath. There it is. Nia did not move. Mercer pointed the flashlight toward her face again, forcing her eyes to narrow slightly against the brightness. Most people just cooperate during a simple stop. Most people also expect fairness during one. Mercer lowered the flashlight slowly. You think this is unfair? Nia held his gaze despite the exhaustion dragging at her shoulders. I think you decided who I was before you ever walked up to my window. The wind shifted again, colder this time. Mercer's expression flattened immediately. Behind them, another patrol unit passed on the far side of the highway before disappearing into the rain. For a few seconds neither of them spoke. Then Mercer reached toward the radio attached to his shoulder. Dispatch, he said calmly, requesting secondary unit for roadside assistance. Nia heard the slight emphasis in his voice. It was not assistance he wanted. It was pressure. More uniforms. More authority standing around her car under flashing lights until compliance became easier than dignity. Mercer looked back at her after releasing the button. You know what usually happens when people make routine stops complicated? Nia answered softly. Sometimes the stop was never routine to begin with. Mercer smiled again, but this time there was irritation underneath it. You got an answer for everything. Nia's phone vibrated once more inside her coat pocket. A voicemail notification. Hospital number again. She closed her eyes for half a second before opening them. Mercer noticed immediately. You seem nervous. I am tired. Same thing sometimes. Rainwater slid from the edge of the Camry roof and splashed near Nia's feet. Her hands had started trembling slightly from the cold, so she folded them together to hide it. Mercer caught the movement anyway. See that, he said. That right there tells me I should trust my instincts. Nia looked past him toward the empty dark highway stretching south through Atlanta. No, she said quietly. That tells you I have been standing in freezing rain for almost an hour while you look for a reason to justify what you already decided. The words hung between them in the cold air. Mercer's jaw tightened again. Somewhere in the distance, another siren echoed briefly across the city. Then, far behind them, headlights appeared through the rain. Another patrol vehicle approaching slowly. The second patrol car pulled onto the shoulder with a spray of rainwater and flashing amber lights cutting through the darkness behind Mercer's cruiser. Nia watched silently as a younger officer stepped out into the cold night air, adjusting his jacket against the wind before walking toward them. He looked barely older than 30. Broad shoulders. Clean haircut. Tired eyes. His name tag read Collins. Mercer motioned him over immediately without taking his eyes off Nia. Possible narcotics situation, Mercer said loud enough for her to hear. Subject is refusing cooperation. Nia looked at him calmly. I have complied with every lawful instruction you have given. Collins glanced between them uncertainly. The younger officer seemed to notice the soaked coat, the trembling hands from the cold, the pharmacy bag visible through the back seat window. Did dispatch confirm anything? Collins asked quietly. Mercer shrugged. Not yet. But something feels off. The word settled heavily into the freezing air. Something feels off. Nia had heard versions of that sentence her entire life. In department stores. Airports. Parking garages. Elevator rides that suddenly went silent when she stepped inside. Mercer pointed toward the Camry again. She refuses consent to search. Collins looked toward Nia. Ma'am, is there a reason you do not want the vehicle checked? Nia met his eyes. Because constitutional rights do not disappear because somebody gets suspicious. Collins shifted awkwardly. Mercer let out another dry laugh. See what I mean? Every answer sounds rehearsed. A pickup truck slowed almost to a stop beside the shoulder now. Someone inside held up a phone toward the flashing lights before driving away again. Nia noticed Mercer straighten slightly the moment he saw the camera. Public attention energized him. The rain continued falling softly across the highway, coating everything in silver reflections. Nia could feel water inside her shoes now. Her fingers had gone numb hours ago. She glanced briefly toward the hospital voicemail notification still glowing on her phone screen through the fabric of her pocket. 3 missed calls now. Mercer noticed her glance again. You expecting somebody? My mother is in the hospital. For the first time all night, Mercer hesitated. Just for a second. Then his expression hardened again. Everybody has a story. Nia swallowed quietly at that. Not because the words hurt. Because they reminded her how easy it was for some people to stop seeing humanity once authority entered the room. Collins looked uncomfortable now. Maybe we should wrap this up if there is no probable cause, he said carefully. Mercer ignored him completely. He stepped toward the rear passenger side of the Camry and shined his flashlight through the window again. The beam stopped on the pharmacy bag. What is in there? Medication. For who? My mother. Mercer stared at the bag another moment before turning back toward her. Open the car. Nia remained still beneath the flashing lights. No, officer. Mercer's patience snapped visibly this time. You understand refusing cooperation makes you look worse, right? Nia's wet hair clung against her cheek as cold wind swept across the shoulder again. No, she answered softly. It makes you angry because you cannot force agreement out of me. Collins exhaled slowly under his breath. Another silence settled over the roadside. Traffic passed in long blurred streaks beyond them while rainwater trickled down the side of the cruiser. Then Mercer suddenly reached for his radio again. Dispatch, he said sharply, run federal database cross-reference on vehicle registration. Collins frowned slightly. Federal? Mercer kept his eyes on Nia. Just covering all bases. Nia finally looked directly at him again, and something in her expression changed. Not fear. Not frustration. Something quieter. Like a person slowly realizing exactly who they were standing in front of. Mercer noticed the change immediately. What? He asked. Nia studied him for a long moment while rain tapped softly against metal and glass around them. Then she spoke in the calmest voice he had heard all night. Officer Mercer, do you always treat people this way when you think nobody important is watching? The question stayed in the air after Nia spoke it, quiet and steady beneath the sound of rain tapping against metal and pavement. Officer. Mercer did not answer right away. The flashing lights reflected across his face while cold wind moved through the trees lining the edge of the highway. Beside him, Officer Collins shifted awkwardly, glancing between the two of them like he suddenly realized this stop had become something heavier than paperwork and suspicion. Mercer finally scoffed under his breath. Do not try turning this around on me. Nia lowered her eyes for a moment, watching rainwater ripple around her shoes in thin silver circles. Her body felt heavier now. The cold had settled deep into her muscles, and exhaustion pressed behind her eyes hard enough to blur the lights for half a second whenever she blinked. Still, her voice stayed calm. I am not turning anything around. I am asking you a question. Mercer stared at her, jaw tight. The highway noise seemed farther away suddenly, drowned beneath the soft crackle of police radios and the steady hiss of rain. Then Collins quietly cleared his throat. Maybe we should just issue the citation or warning and move on. Mercer did not even look at him. You can wait in your vehicle if you are uncomfortable. Collins fell silent immediately. Nia noticed the embarrassment cross the younger officer's face before he looked away toward traffic. For a long moment, nobody spoke. A pair of headlights swept across the roadside, briefly illuminating the pharmacy bag inside the Camry before fading back into darkness. Nia's phone vibrated again inside her pocket. For missed calls now. Her throat tightened softly. She imagined her mother waking up alone in that pale hospital room, reaching toward the empty bedside table where the medication should have been hours ago. The image hurt more than the rain. Mercer folded his arms against the cold. "You know what your issue is," he said. "You think because you speak calmly, people cannot tell when something is off." Nia looked up slowly. "No, officer. I think calm people scare you because you cannot control the story once they stop reacting emotionally." The words landed harder than shouting ever could have. Collins looked down immediately. Mercer's face hardened beneath the flashing lights. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled again, low and heavy across the city skyline. Then silence returned. Nia suddenly felt the full weight of the night settle onto her shoulders all at once. The sleepless hours. The hospital smell still trapped in her clothes. The cold rain soaking through her coat. The humiliation of standing under police lights while strangers drove past making assumptions about her life in seconds. Her hands trembled again despite how tightly she held them together. She hated that part most. Not the fear. The exhaustion. The endless exhaustion of always needing to remain calm so other people could stay comfortable. Mercer noticed her shaking hands and mistook them for weakness. "There it is," he said quietly. "Now we are getting somewhere." Nia closed her eyes briefly. Just one breath. One slow inhale through freezing air that smelled like wet asphalt and gasoline. When she opened them again, the anger people expected from her still was not there. Only sadness. Deep and tired. "Officer Mercer," she said softly, "do you know what happens when authority forgets compassion?" Mercer frowned slightly but said nothing. Nia looked toward the dark highway stretching endlessly through the rain. People stopped trusting the people sworn to protect them. The wind blew harder suddenly, scattering rain across the shoulder in sharp sideways streaks. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then Mercer's radio crackled violently against the silence. A dispatcher's voice burst through the static, urgent this time. "All units, be advised. Federal Task Force requesting immediate contact regarding active cyber operation downtown. Repeat, Federal coordination in progress." Mercer reached for the radio automatically. But before he could answer, another voice came through clearer than before. "Attempting to locate Special Agent Nia Brooks immediately." Everything stopped moving for a second after the dispatcher said her name. The rain still fell. Traffic still rolled across the interstate. Red and blue lights still flashed against the wet pavement. But the energy around the roadside changed instantly, like the entire night had suddenly inhaled and forgotten how to breathe. "Back out." Officer Collins looked directly at Nia first. Then slowly toward Mercer. Mercer did not move at all. His hand remained frozen against the radio attached to his shoulder while static crackled softly through the silence. "Repeat that," he said finally, but his voice no longer carried the same confidence. The dispatcher answered immediately. "Federal Task Force requesting immediate contact with Special Agent Nia Brooks regarding ongoing cyber operation downtown Atlanta. Priority response requested." Collins blinked hard, trying to process the words. Mercer stared at Nia as if seeing her clearly for the first time all night. Rainwater slid down the side of his face unnoticed now. Nia said nothing. She simply reached slowly into the inside pocket of her soaked coat while both officers watched carefully. Her movements stayed calm despite the freezing cold numbing her fingers. Then she removed a black leather credential wallet and held it quietly in her hand beneath the flashing lights. The gold badge caught the red and blue reflections first. Then the identification card beside it became visible. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Special Agent Nia Brooks. Mercer's face drained of color almost instantly. Collins took one step backward without realizing it. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The only sound was rain tapping softly against the hood of the cruiser and distant tires rushing across wet pavement. Mercer looked down at the badge again like he hoped he had misunderstood what he was seeing. But the name matched the radio call perfectly. The same woman he had left standing in freezing rain for nearly an hour was the federal agent his department had apparently been trying to contact all night. Nia slowly lowered the credential wallet but did not put it away yet. Her hands still trembled slightly from the cold. "I told you I worked downtown," she said quietly. Mercer opened his mouth once, then closed it again. For the first time since the stop began, he looked unsure of himself. Completely unsure. Collins cleared his throat softly. "Special Agent Brooks, we did not know." Nia looked at him gently before he could finish. "That is the problem." The words landed with devastating calm. Mercer swallowed hard. "Ma'am, if there has been some misunderstanding, a misunderstanding?" Nia repeated softly. She looked around at the flashing lights reflecting across the highway shoulder, the soaked pavement beneath her feet, the open car door still exposed to the rain. "You assumed I was dangerous before you even knew my name." Mercer stared at her silently. Nia continued, her voice never rising above the storm around them. "You questioned whether the car belonged to me. You implied I was carrying drugs. You called for backup because I asked for my constitutional rights to be respected." Collins lowered his eyes. Mercer looked like he wanted to interrupt but could not find the words quickly enough. Nia glanced briefly toward the back seat where the pharmacy bag still rested under the glow of passing headlights. "My mother is in the hospital tonight," she said quietly. "I spent 18 hours working an active federal case before driving across the city to pick up medication she needed before midnight." Mercer's expression shifted then. Not fear exactly. Something heavier. Shame beginning to surface underneath authority. Nia looked directly into his eyes again while rain rolled down her face and disappeared beneath the collar of her coat. "And none of that mattered to you," she said softly. "Because you decided who I was the moment you saw me." The dispatcher's voice crackled through Mercer's radio again. "Unit 12, confirm status regarding Special Agent Brooks." Mercer did not answer immediately. He simply stood there beneath the flashing lights, staring at the woman he had spent the last hour trying to diminish, while the truth settled over the roadside heavier than the storm itself. Officer Mercer finally lifted the radio toward his mouth, but his hand no longer looked steady. Rainwater slid from his sleeve while static crackled softly between breaths. "Unit 12 responding," he said quietly. "Special Agent Brooks located." The dispatcher immediately answered with visible urgency even through the distortion. "Copy that. Federal Operations Center has been attempting contact for 40 minutes. Agent Brooks is needed. Downtown immediately." Mercer swallowed once before lowering the radio slowly. The authority that had filled his voice earlier was gone now, replaced by something uncertain and exposed. Nia stood silently beneath the flashing lights, soaked from the rain, exhaustion written softly across her face. Yet somehow she still looked more composed than either officer standing beside her. Collins shifted awkwardly again before stepping forward. "Special Agent Brooks," he said carefully, "I want to apologize for the misunderstanding tonight." Nia looked at him for a moment. Unlike Mercer, Collins could barely hold eye contact now. She understood why. Some people felt guilt immediately once truth arrived. Others only felt embarrassment after power disappeared. Mercer remained completely still beside the cruiser. The rain had slowed to a cold mist drifting through the highway lights. Cars continued passing by without slowing now. The moment of public attention was fading, leaving only silence behind. Nia slowly placed her FBI credentials back inside her coat pocket. "This was never about misunderstanding," she said softly. Mercer looked up at her immediately. "Agent Brooks, I admit I may have handled this stop poorly, but poorly," she interrupted gently. Not angry. Not loud. Somehow that made it worse. You treated me like a threat because I questioned you politely. Mercer opened his mouth, but no words came out this time. Nia continued quietly. You assumed I did not belong in my own car. You assumed I was dangerous because I stayed calm. You assumed I needed to be controlled because I knew my rights. The cold wind moved through the roadside again, carrying the smell of rain and gasoline across the shoulder. Collins lowered his eyes toward the pavement. Mercer's face tightened beneath the flashing lights. I was doing my job, he said finally, though even he sounded unsure now. Nia looked at him steadily. Your job is public safety. Not humiliation. The sentence settled heavily into the silence around them. Mercer stared at her for several seconds before glancing away toward the dark highway. For the first time all night, he looked smaller somehow. Not physically. Morally. Nia reached into the back seat through the open car door and carefully picked up the pharmacy bag. The paper had become damp from hours in the cold air. She checked the bottles inside quietly before closing the bag again. My mother taught elementary school for 31 years, she said softly without looking at either officer. She used to tell her students that authority means protecting people who cannot protect themselves. Mercer remained silent. Nia finally looked back at him. Somewhere along the way, too many people forgot that. The younger officer exhaled quietly beside the cruiser. Mercer rubbed rainwater from the back of his neck, unable to meet her eyes now. Agent Brooks, he said carefully, I truly am sorry. Nia studied him for a long moment beneath the fading storm. She could have humiliated him then. She could have threatened complaints, investigations, headlines, consequences. Mercer clearly knew that too. Fear had finally entered his expression. But Nia only looked tired. Deeply tired. I do not need your fear, she said quietly. I need you to remember this stop the next time somebody looks different from you. Mercer stared at her in silence. The flashing lights reflected across the wet pavement between them like broken pieces of color drifting through the darkness. Then Nia opened the driver's side door slowly and paused before getting inside. Respect should not begin after someone proves they matter, she said softly. It should begin the moment they are human. Neither officer spoke after that. The only sound left was rain tapping gently against the roof of the cruiser while the night settled quietly around them. The engine of the Camry started softly beneath the rain, its quiet hum barely audible under the distant rush of traffic moving through Atlanta after midnight. Nia sat behind the wheel for a moment without driving away. Her hands rested lightly against the steering wheel while droplets slid down the windshield in slow uneven lines. The patrol lights still flashed behind her, washing the inside of the car in fading red and blue reflections. Officer Collins stood beside the second cruiser with his head lowered, silent and motionless. Mercer remained near the shoulder where she had left him, one hand resting against his belt, the other hanging loosely at his side. He looked older now somehow. Smaller than he had an hour ago. Nia glanced toward the damp pharmacy bag resting carefully in the passenger seat beside her. One of the paper corners had torn slightly from the rain. She reached over gently and straightened it before looking back through the windshield. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was not the hospital. It was the Federal Operations Center downtown. She answered quietly. Brooks. A tense voice responded immediately. Agent Brooks, we have been trying to reach you for almost an hour. Are you all right? Nia looked through the rain-streaked glass toward the officers outside before answering. I am now. The voice on the line exhaled with relief. We need you downtown as soon as possible. I understand. She ended the call softly and placed the phone face down beside the gearshift. Outside, the storm had finally started breaking apart. The heavy rain was fading into a thin mist drifting across the highway beneath the streetlights. For the first time all night, the sky no longer felt suffocating. Nia slowly rolled the driver's side window down halfway. Cold air moved into the car immediately, carrying the smell of wet pavement and pine trees. Mercer looked up when he heard the window motor. For a second, neither of them spoke. The flashing lights reflected across his face while passing headlights swept through the darkness behind him. Nia studied him quietly. She saw the shame there now. Real shame. Not fear of consequences. Not embarrassment over her badge. Something deeper. The realization that he had become the kind of officer people prayed they would never encounter alone at night. Mercer stepped closer to the window carefully, as if unsure whether he deserved to. "Agent Brooks," he said softly, "I know saying sorry does not fix tonight." Nia listened without interrupting. Mercer swallowed once before continuing. "But I will remember it." Nia looked at him for a long moment. Then her eyes drifted briefly toward Collins standing silently near the cruisers. "Make sure he remembers too," she said quietly. Mercer turned slightly toward the younger officer before nodding once. Nia rested her hand against the steering wheel again. People should not have to prove they are important before they are treated with dignity. Mercer lowered his eyes. "You are right." The words came out almost as a whisper. Nia gave a small tired nod before finally shifting the car into drive. The Camry rolled slowly forward across the wet shoulder while the patrol lights reflected across the trunk in streaks of red and blue. As she pulled back onto the interstate, the city skyline appeared faintly ahead through the mist, glowing silver against the night sky. In the rearview mirror, Mercer remained standing exactly where she had left him. Motionless beneath the fading storm. The flashing lights painted long broken reflections across the empty highway around him while traffic rushed past in both directions, indifferent to what had changed on that roadside tonight. Nia drove south toward downtown Atlanta with one hand on the wheel and the pharmacy bag resting beside her like something fragile and sacred. Behind her, the patrol lights finally switched off one by one, leaving only darkness, rainwater, and the quiet weight of a lesson that would follow somebody home long after the storm was gone.